Hi everyone, I'm Nicole Seymour, Assistant Professor of English at Cal State Fullerton and also one of the area team coordinators for the CAN. I'll be responding to option 1 in my presentation, which was what is one of your best practices in teaching climate change, climate justice, sustainability, etc. in a culturally responsive and sustaining way. In this presentation, I will explain how I teach cultural texts that model a broad range of affective responses to climate change and sustainability. That is, that move beyond gloom and doom and other dominant affects to showcase humor, irony, irreverence, ambivalence, and other inappropriate feelings. As I will explain, these texts do multifaceted work. First, they allow us to understand climate change and sustainability as affective and not just scientific issues. Second, they open much-needed discussions with students around their own feelings. And third, they allow us to explore the political contributions of traditions such as parody and satire. I thought I would start by defining affect. This has become a major term within the humanities with the rise of affect theory, but perhaps it hasn't circulated as much elsewhere. Affect, as I will use it here, means both feeling, as in an emotional pull or reaction, and sensibility, as in attitude or tone. In my teaching and research, I show how the dominant affects in environmental art, activism, and discourse are gloom and doom, guilt, prescriptiveness, sentimentality, reverence, wonder, seriousness, sincerity, self-righteousness, and perfectionism. We've seen a lot of gloom and doom, in particular, in the past couple days over Donald Trump's decision to exit the Paris Climate Agreement. And in fact, new terms have been coined recently to describe painful reactions to climate change and other environmental crises. From climate grief, described in a recent grist.org article, to environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht's notion of solastalgia, which is something of a twist on nostalgia. So it's the feeling you have when a familiar place, your home, starts to change. But I am more interested in, of course, in inappropriate affects, including irreverence, irony, ambivalence, frivolity, indecorum, awkwardness, sardonicism, humor, perversity, and playfulness. In my teaching and research, I look at how these affects crop up in texts that cover a wide range of environmental issues, from factory farming to mountaintop removal to habitat destruction. Today, I will only talk about these affects in relation to climate change and sustainability. And I want to do so through two contemporary texts. The first is Canadian playwright Eileen Kwan's short, satirical climate change-themed play, Cuisine. And Eileen Kwan's name is spelled E-L-Y-N-E-Q-U-A-N for future reference. The second text is an environmentally themed episode of the Australian sitcom Kath and Kim. I've taught cuisine several times in our Intro to the Major course, Analysis of Literary Forms, as well as in a course I designed titled Literature and the Environment. And I just taught Kath and Kim the first time this past semester in Literature and the Environment. I'll describe these texts briefly. Cuisine is set at a restaurant in an unspecified future, wherein warming waters and perhaps overfishing have dramatically shifted human diets. A trio of ungendered, unnamed, and amusingly inane diners eat jellyfish, while moaning about how they miss eating regular fish, salmon in particular, and gossiping about a celebrity chef who supposedly hosts black market seafood dinners for the right price. The Kath and Kim episode, Environment, that's the title, follows a peppy suburban mother's inept attempts to go green, and her treatment of the task as a kind of consumerism, as she turns from fetishizing clothing and jewelry to fetishizing gray water tanks. For the rest of my talk, I will explain how and why I see teaching texts like these as a best practice. And I'll start with my first point. Number 1, these texts identify climate change and sustainability as affective and not just scientific issues. So it's become increasingly clear, especially in the last year, that environmental and political stances are more a matter of emotion than rational knowledge. People across the political spectrum vote the way they vote, for example, because they already have certain feelings in place, not because they've been presented with facts or data. The recent book, The Enigma of Reason, discusses this phenomenon, as does a recent Dartmouth study titled, quote, When Corrections Fail, the Persistence of Political Misperceptions. When it comes to our subject at hand, the mountains of evidence about climate change clearly fail to convince certain people, or are simply irrelevant to the way that they already feel and plan to act. Thus, teaching texts with a focus on affect allows us to understand that paradigm and discuss potential paths, new paths within or even out of it. More specifically, teaching texts that are funny, irreverent, ironic, and so forth allows us to think about the unique potentials of these inappropriate affects. So, for example, when we watch Kath and Kim, we ask what this wildly popular, internationally distributed comedy can do in terms of reaching new audiences that, say, a small release documentary cannot. Teaching texts that are funny, irreverent, ironic, and so forth also allows my students and myself to think through the limitations of dominant affective modes, not just gloom and doom, but also guilt and perfectionism. Nature writer David Gessner has recently argued that, quote, one of the reasons people steer clear of environmentalism is all the guilt associated with it. The creepy feeling that by doing what everyone else in one's society is doing, driving, washing the dishes, catching a flight, we are bringing about the end of the world, end quote. We see the role of guilt in Kath and Kim, for example, when Kath's recycling bin starts overflowing and she surreptitiously dumps it in the trash. Her neighbor catches her and she responds defensively, What, Mandy? We're putting in a grey water tank, actually, so it do not pot. Don't worry. That was my terrible Australian accent. She's actually a lot more defensive than that. She's sort of, surreptitiously dumping, and then she sees that her neighbor's kind of watching her across the way and kind of flips out. Scholars such as Kari Norgard have confirmed the limitations of dominant environmental affects. In her sociological study of a small town in Norway, palpably affected by climate change, Norgard found that information overload leads to feelings like guilt and then to emotional paralysis, probably environmental paralysis too. Thus, ironically, the more one knows about climate change, the less likely one may be to act. In other words, dominant environmental affects are actually stultifying or unproductive, which is perhaps why, for example, Eileen Kwan decided to make her play an amusing satire rather than a finger-wagging expose. Again, how might inappropriate affects chart out new rhetorical or activist paths? These are questions I debate with my students. Number 2, teaching these texts opens up discussions with students around their own feelings. Environmental educator Ellen Kelsey recently declared that, quote, we talk a lot about our knowledge of the environment, but feelings are often left out, end quote. As frontline educators, I believe we have a responsibility to talk about those feelings and to give students tools to work through them. I should mention here that someone else in the CAN, I believe it's Amanda Baugh, is following the same line of thinking. So I saw the title of her talk, or the subtitle of her talk was Teaching Climate Change Without Hopeless Despair. So I look forward to hearing how our work might overlap. My students and I thus consider how inappropriate affects like humor and irony might offer coping mechanisms, enact catharsis, raise activist morale, or help build community. And this is what I take to be the culturally responsive aspect of my text. More specifically, the texts I teach allow us to critique the behaviors on display, as well as ruefully recognize how much they look like our own behaviors. Laughing at Kath's failures, guilt, and defensiveness in Kath and Kim prompts discussions of our own failures, guilt, and defensiveness. Her consumerism also provides the opportunity to discuss how sustainability often becomes a matter of individual market choices. When we read cuisine, we can work through our own guilt over still eating fish or meat, as well as the pleasures of still eating fish or meat, and thereby recognize the ambivalence of our feelings in times of environmental crisis. And I think the humorous, playful nature of these texts is crucial here. So their lack of finger wagging is specifically what allows us the emotional space to do that kind of exploration. Finally, number 3, texts like Kwan's Cuisine and Kath and Kim demonstrate the political contributions of traditions such as satire and parody. Here we get into important disciplinary questions, of course, such as how satire works, how parody works, how irony works, and what makes it successful. We have to employ our English major skills, such as close reading and rhetorical analysis. So, for example, when we look at cuisine, we think about why it's important that the characters are nameless and non-gender specific. And when we all agree that the play is funny or that it's making fun, I ask my students, what exactly is it making fun of? I usually get a range of different but very interesting and smart answers, ranging from foodie culture to wealthy entitlement to, of course, climate change denial. And how do we know that that's what's being made fun of? And what exactly makes it funny? These questions sometimes allow us to have conversations about cultural norms, what particular groups find funny and why, and what particular national nuances the creators may be responding to. And of course, I always have to warn my students before we do this work that the quickest way to kill a joke is to analyze it, so I allow them to have a little pleasure before we get into the grim analysis. Discussing the political contributions of traditions such as satire and parody also leads us to broader, important conversations that extend beyond our discipline and even beyond academia. For example, when I asked my students in my literature and environment course last semester to write a question for our final exam, one group came up with a version of something like, "What are the pitfalls of climate change comedy?" And of course, I had been focusing on the exciting potentials, like, oh, these are, important alternatives. They're so amusing. They do all the things that I've just been describing in this presentation. But what the students came up with was, well, let's look at the negatives, right? Let's look at the fallout. Let's look at the risks of comedy and these other inappropriate affects. So we ended up discussing the recent claim that a few cultural critics have made, that Donald Trump got elected basically because of comedy. That is, because people found him amusing because they didn't take him seriously. They therefore didn't understand him as a threat, and they gave him undue airtime. So that's kind of a humor as distraction, humor as liability argument. And I obviously don't agree with that argument personally, as you can probably imagine, but we can see that it's very much worth discussing with students. So that is basically it. That is my take on how and why to teach beyond gloom and doom. And I'll just give you real quick a little bit of information on how to find my texts if you're interested in checking them out. Kath and Kim is available on iTunes, and Cuisine was originally made available in 2015 through Climate Change Theater Action, which is a fantastic biannual global project that my students and I participate in and that anyone can participate in. There will be another one in fall 2017, and you can just Google it if you're interested. But please do let me know if you're interested in doing something with it so we could potentially collaborate. Anyway, Cuisine may still be available through the 2015 project website for Climate Change Theater Action, but I also have the PDF copy if anyone would like to see it. I look forward to your comments and questions, and of course to learning more about everyone else's work. Thank you.